The dust cloud billowed across the horizon as Pearl Gibson hiked up her white wedding dress, its once pristine fabric now stained with the red earth of Colorado Territory. The year was 1876, and she was supposed to be Mrs. Harold Blackwell by now, the dutiful wife of Silver Creek's wealthiest businessman. Instead, she was running for her life, or at least for her freedom, with nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's silver locket around her neck. "Keep moving," she muttered to herself, ignoring the burning in her lungs and the blisters forming on her heels from the impractical satin shoes. She'd left behind everything: the grand ceremony at the town's newly built chapel, the reception that was to follow at Blackwell Manor, and the life of luxury that had been carefully arranged for her by her father. Pearl had never wanted to marry Harold. At 37, he was nearly twice her age, with cold eyes that regarded her as little more than property to be acquired. Her father, the town doctor, had arranged the marriage to secure his own debts and elevate their family's standing. What her father failed to understand was that Pearl had dreams of her own dreams that didn't involve being a trophy wife to a man who collected businesses and people with equal dispassion. The sound of hoofbeats in the distance made her heart hammer against her ribs. They were coming for her. Of course, they would. No one embarrassed Harold Blackwell and got away with it. Pearl ducked into a thicket of scrub oak, crouching low as she tried to steady her breathing. The thorny branches snagged at her veil, yanking it from her carefully pinned hair. She watched it float away on the breeze, a white flag of surrender she refused to wave. The riders passed within 20 feet of her hiding place, their voices carrying on the wind. "She couldn't have gotten far in those fancy shoes," one man called to another. "Blackwell's offering $50 to whoever brings her back." $50, another whistled. "For a runaway bride must be mighty special." "Or mighty stubborn," the first one laughed. "Split up. She's got to be around here somewhere." Pearl waited until the sounds of their horses faded before she dared move again. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. Soon it would be dark, and while that would offer her some cover, it also meant the dangers of the untamed West would come alive. Coyotes, rattlesnakes, and the bitter cold of the mountain night were all threats to a woman alone. But she'd rather face those dangers than the life awaiting her back in Silver Creek. With determination setting her jaw, Pearl continued eastward. She'd overheard travelers at her father's clinic speaking of a stage line that ran through a settlement about 15 miles from Silver Creek. If she could reach it by tomorrow afternoon, she might be able to board a coach heading to Denver. From there, the possibilities seemed endless. Perhaps she could find work as a teacher or a nurse, using the education her mother had insisted she receive despite her father's protests. The twilight was fading fast when Pearl spotted a thin wisp of smoke curling up from beyond the next ridge. A campfire. Her instinct was to avoid it. Anyone camping out here could be as dangerous as what she was running from. But her feet were bleeding through her ruined shoes, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Without shelter or supplies, she might not survive the night. Caution warring with desperation, Pearl crept closer, staying low to the ground. As she peered over the ridge, she saw a small camp set up near a bubbling creek. A lean-to shelter, a modest fire, and a single horse tethered nearby. A figure sat by the fire, silhouetted against the flames, seeming to be alone. Pearl hesitated. One person was less threatening than a group, but still a risk. As she weighed her options, her foot dislodged a stone, sending it tumbling down the ridge. The figure at the campfire jumped to their feet with startling speed, a revolver appearing in their hand, pointed in Pearl's direction. "Who's there?" a deep voice called out. A man's voice, firm but not threatening. Show yourself nice and slow." Pearl considered running, but she was too tired, too hungry, and too cold. With a deep breath, she stood up, her hands raised. "Please," she called out, her voice cracking. "I mean no harm." The man kept his gun trained on her as she slowly made her way down the ridge, the tattered remains of her wedding dress catching on rocks and brush. "Madam." The confusion in his voice was evident as she stepped into the circle of firelight. Is that a wedding dress?" Pearl looked down at herself and almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "It was," she admitted. "Earlier today." The man holstered his weapon, his brow furrowed with concern. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of the stormy sky. His clothes were practical worn denim, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest. A cowboy's hat rested on a nearby saddle. "Name's Nathaniel Everett," he said, his gaze taking in her bedraggled appearance with a mix of wariness and compassion. "Most folks call me Nate." "Pearl," she replied, leaving off her surname in case her pursuers came this way. "Pearl G." "Well, Miss Pearl," Nate said, gesturing to the fire, "looks to me like you could use a place to rest and maybe something warm to drink." He paused, then added carefully, "And perhaps an explanation for why you're wandering these parts alone in a wedding dress." Pearl hesitated, unsure how much to share with this stranger, but something in his steady gaze made her think that Nathaniel Everett might be different from the men she'd known in Silver Creek. "I ran," she said simply. "From a wedding I didn't want, to a man I couldn't bear to marry." Nate nodded slowly, as if this explanation made perfect sense. "Got some coffee brewing," he said, turning to tend to a small pot nestled in the coals. "And some beans and jerky. Not much of a feast, but it's hot." "Thank you," Pearl said, realizing just how ravenous she was. "I haven't eaten since breakfast." As she sank down by the fire, the enormity of what she'd done finally hit her. She had no money, no possessions beyond the clothes on her back, and no plan beyond fleeing. Tears welled up in her eyes and she blinked rapidly, determined not to break down in front of this stranger. Nate handed her a tin cup of steaming coffee, pretending not to notice her struggle for composure. "Running from something's one thing," he said quietly, serving up a plate of beans. "Knowing what you're running to, that's another matter entirely." Pearl accepted the food with murmured thanks. "I haven't figured that part out yet," she admitted. "I just knew I couldn't stay." Nate settled back on his bedroll across the fire. "Well, Miss Pearl, I reckon sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is say no, even when everyone's expecting them to say yes." Their eyes met over the dancing flames, and for the first time since she'd fled the chapel, Pearl felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps she wasn't alone after all. As they ate in companionable silence, Pearl couldn't help but notice the way Nate kept scanning their surroundings, his hand never far from his revolver. "Are you expecting trouble?" she finally asked. A hint of a smile crossed his face. "Just habit, madam. Been riding these parts long enough to know trouble rarely announces itself before arriving." He studied her for a moment. "Speaking of which, would I be right in guessing there might be folks looking for you?" Pearl nodded reluctantly. "The man I was supposed to marry, Harold Blackwell, he's not the kind who takes kindly to being left at the altar. He's sent men after me." Nate whistled low. "Harold Blackwell of Silver Creek owns half the businesses between here and Denver." Pearl's heart sank. If even a solitary cowboy like Nathaniel Everett knew of Blackwell's reach, then her chances of escaping seemed slimmer by the minute. "That would be him," she confirmed. "Well," Nate said, tossing another small log onto the fire, "that does complicate matters." Pearl set her empty plate aside. "I should go. I've already put you at risk by being here." "Now hold on," Nate said, raising a hand. "Night's falling and these hills aren't safe for anyone traveling alone, especially not someone dressed for a wedding rather than wilderness." He glanced at her ruined shoes and torn dress. "I've got some spare clothes in my pack that might serve you better than that gown, and come morning, we can figure out a plan." "We?" Pearl questioned, surprised by his offer of assistance. Nate shrugged, a casual gesture that didn't quite mask the seriousness in his eyes. "I'm heading to Wildwood Station myself. It's about a day's ride from here. Got a small ranch there that needs tending." He hesitated, then added, "It's far enough from Silver Creek that Blackwell's influence doesn't reach quite so strong. Might be a good place for you to lay low until you decide your next move." Pearl was overwhelmed by his kindness, but caution made her wary. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "True enough," Nate agreed, his gaze steady, "but I know Blackwell's type. Men who think money and power give them the right to own people." Something dark flickered across his features. "Let's just say I've got no love for men like that." There was a story there, Pearl sensed, but it wasn't her place to pry. "I can pay you back," she offered. "Once I find work, we'll worry about all that later," Nate interrupted gently. "For now, let's focus on getting you some proper clothes and a good night's rest." He rummaged through his saddlebag and produced a flannel shirt, a pair of worn but clean trousers, and some woolen socks. "They'll be big on you, but they'll keep you warmer than that dress. There's a bend in the creek just beyond those cottonwoods. You can change there. I'll keep watch from here, make sure no one comes along." Pearl accepted the clothes with gratitude, touched by his consideration for her modesty. As she made her way to the creek, she glanced back to see Nate adding more wood to the fire, his profile strong against the growing darkness. For a man she'd just met, there was something reassuringly solid about Nathaniel Everett. The water in the creek was bitingly cold as Pearl washed the dirt from her face and hands. She carefully removed her ruined wedding dress, folding it neatly despite its tattered state. It had cost her father a small fortune, and though she had no intention of wearing it again, destroying it seemed wasteful. Nate's clothes swam on her slender frame, but the soft flannel felt heavenly against her skin after hours in the restrictive corset and layers of her wedding attire. She rolled up the sleeves and pant legs, cinched the trousers with a length of ribbon from her petticoat, and felt instantly more capable than she had in her bridal finery. When Pearl returned to camp, she found that Nate had arranged his bedroll for her and was busy fashioning a makeshift sleeping area for himself, using his saddle as a pillow and his duster as a blanket. "You should take your bedroll," Pearl protested. "I can sleep by the fire." Nate shook his head firmly. "My ma raised me better than that, Miss Pearl. You take the bedroll. I've slept under the stars more nights than I can count." Too exhausted to argue further, Pearl sank onto the offered bedding. As she stretched out, every muscle in her body ached with the day's exertions. "Thank you," she murmured, already feeling sleep pulling at her. "Get some rest," Nate replied, settling himself on the other side of the fire. "We'll head out at first light." Pearl wanted to say more to express the depth of her gratitude, to ask about Wildwood Station, to learn more about the quiet cowboy who'd offered her sanctuary when she needed it most. But exhaustion claimed her before she could form the words, and she drifted into a dreamless sleep beneath the vast Colorado sky. The soft nickering of Nate's horse woke Pearl just before dawn. For a moment she was disoriented, the events of the previous day rushing back as she blinked up at the lightening sky. Across the smoldering remains of their campfire, Nate was already awake, saddling his horse with practiced efficiency. "Morning," he said, when he noticed her stirring. "Hope you slept well." Pearl sat up, running a hand through her tangled hair. "Better than I expected to," she admitted, though I'm feeling yesterday's run in every muscle." Nate offered a sympathetic smile. "First day in the saddle's likely to add to that, I'm afraid. But Wildwood's not too far. We should make it by sundown if we push on." The reality of her situation settled over Pearl as she washed her face in the creek. She was truly leaving behind everything she'd known: her home, her father, her position as the doctor's daughter. The future stretched before her, uncertain and frightening, yet strangely exhilarating in its possibilities. When she returned to camp, Nate had coffee ready and was frying bacon in a small skillet. "Not much," he apologized, "but it'll keep us going till midday." "It smells wonderful," Pearl assured him, accepting a tin plate with gratitude. As they ate, Nate outlined his plan. "We'll stick to the high country," he explained. "Avoid the main trails where Blackwell's men might be looking. It'll add some time to our journey, but it's safer." "You seem to know these parts well," Pearl observed. Nate nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon habitually. "Been ranching and driving cattle through this territory for near on 10 years now. Started as a hand on other folks' spreads, saved up enough to buy my own place 3 years back." A note of pride entered his voice. "It's not much compared to what some have, but it's mine, free and clear." Pearl admired his independence. "That's more than many can say." "What about you?" Nate asked as they cleaned up their modest breakfast. "What would you have done if you hadn't been promised to Blackwell?" The question caught Pearl by surprise. Few had ever asked what she wanted. "I assisted my father in his medical practice," she said after a moment. "I have some skill with healing. I thought perhaps I might train formally as a nurse someday, but your father had other plans," Nate finished for her. "Yes," Pearl sighed. "After my mother died 2 years ago, he became different, more concerned with status. When his investments failed, Blackwell offered to clear his debts in exchange for my hand." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. "As if I were simply another asset to be traded." Nate's jaw tightened. "No person should be bartered like cattle," he said quietly. "Man or woman." There was that darkness in his expression again, and Pearl wondered what experiences had shaped this cowboy's strong sense of justice. Before she could ask, Nate was on his feet, dousing the fire and preparing to break camp. "Can you ride?" he asked, glancing at his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding. "Yes," Pearl answered. "My mother insisted I learn, though my father thought it unladylike." A genuine smile crossed Nate's face. "Your mother sounds like a woman of sense." "She was," Pearl said softly, touching the silver locket at her throat. "I think she would have approved of what I did yesterday." Nate nodded, then gestured to his horse. "This is Chance. He's steady and has a smooth gait. I'll lead him for the first stretch. Make sure you're comfortable." Pearl approached the horse, who regarded her with intelligent eyes. She stroked his velvety nose, murmuring gentle words of greeting. Chance nickered softly in response. "He likes you," Nate observed, holding the horse steady as Pearl gathered her courage and mounted. It had been some time since she'd ridden, and never in trousers. The sensation was strange but infinitely more practical than side saddle. Nate handed up her wedding dress, now folded into a compact bundle. "Thought you might want to keep this," he said. "Not for wearing, but—" "As a reminder," Pearl finished, touched by his understanding. She secured the bundle behind the saddle as Nate collected their few supplies. With the sun painting the eastern sky in brilliant gold and crimson, they set out. Nate led Chance on foot for the first mile, allowing Pearl to reacquaint herself with the rhythm of riding. They spoke little, both alert for any signs of pursuit, but the morning remained peaceful, broken only by the calls of birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. As the sun climbed higher, Nate stopped in a small clearing. "Time I rode a spell," he said. "You doing all right?" Pearl nodded, surprised to find she was enjoying the journey despite the circumstances. Better than I expected. With practiced ease, Nate swung up behind her, his presence solid and reassuring at her back. "We'll stay off the ridge lines," he said, his breath warm against her ear as he reached around her for the reins. "Less visible that way." Pearl was acutely aware of his proximity, of the steady rise and fall of his chest against her back, of the strength in the arms that encircled her without touching. There was a proper distance between them. Nate was clearly mindful of propriety, despite their unusual circumstances, but the closeness was both unsettling and oddly comforting. They rode in companionable silence for several miles, Nate occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing brief stories about the territory. Pearl learned that he'd come west from Missouri after the war, seeking a fresh start like so many others. He spoke of his small ranch with quiet pride, 60 acres with a modest herd of cattle, a sturdy cabin he'd built himself, and plans for expansion when finances allowed. "And Wildwood Station?" Pearl asked as they paused to rest chance near a small spring. "What sort of place is it?" "Small," Nate admitted, helping her down from the saddle. "Nothing like Silver Creek. Maybe 30, 40 folks call it home. Got a general store, a smithy, small church. No doctor, though there's a woman, Mrs. Sullivan, who knows her way around herbs and such for minor ailments." He glanced at Pearl. "Someone with your skills might be welcome there." Hope fluttered in Pearl's chest at the thought of using her knowledge to build a new life. "Do you think so?" "I do," Nate said, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "Folks there are good people, mostly. Keep to themselves, work hard." He hesitated, then added, "It's the kind of place where a person can start fresh if that's what they're looking for. A fresh start." The very words filled Pearl with a longing so intense it almost hurt. "It sounds perfect," she whispered. They ate a simple lunch of jerky and dried apples, letting Chance graze and drink his fill. As Pearl watched the horse contentedly cropping grass, she was struck by how quickly her life had changed. Just yesterday morning, she'd been in her childhood bedroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror as her father's housekeeper arranged her veil, her future seemingly set in stone. Now she was miles from Silver Creek, dressed in a cowboy's clothes, with nothing to her name but a ruined wedding dress and a silver locket, and yet she felt freer than she had in years. "Penny for your thoughts," Nate said, breaking into her reverie. Pearl smiled. "I was just thinking how strange life can be, how quickly everything can change." "For better or worse," Nate agreed, his gaze thoughtful. "For better, I think," Pearl said firmly. "Despite everything." Something in her tone made Nate study her face more closely. "You know," he said after a moment, "when I first saw you coming down that ridge in your torn wedding dress, I thought you must be half out of your mind with fear. But you weren't, were you? You were scared, sure, but there was something else there." "What do you mean?" Pearl asked, curious about his perception. "Determination," Nate said simply. "I've known hardened men who'd quake at the thought of crossing Harold Blackwell. Yet here you were, a woman alone, with nothing but the clothes on your back, willing to face wilderness and weather rather than marry against your will." He shook his head in admiration. "Reckon you're about the bravest woman I've ever seen." Pearl felt her cheeks warm at his praise. "I don't feel brave," she confessed. "Most of the time I'm terrified, but the thought of being trapped in that life with that man—" She shuddered. "That was more frightening than anything the wilderness could offer." Nate nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's what real courage is, I think. Not the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it." Their gazes held for a long moment, and Pearl felt something shift between them, a connection forming that went beyond the circumstantial alliance of their journey. There was a depth to Nathaniel Everett that intrigued her, a quiet strength and inherent decency that stood in stark contrast to the calculated charm Harold Blackwell had employed to win over Silver Creek society. The moment was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Nate was on his feet instantly, his hand on his revolver. "Get behind those rocks," he ordered quietly, all trace of softness gone from his voice. "Take chance with you." Pearl didn't question him, leading the horse behind a large outcropping of boulders. Her heart hammered as Nate positioned himself where he could see the trail without being immediately visible. The riders, 3 of them, came into view on the ridge they'd avoided earlier. From their vantage point, Pearl could make out their silhouettes against the sky. They paused, seeming to survey the valley below, then continued along the ridgeline, moving away from where she and Nate were hidden. "Blackwell's men," she whispered when Nate joined her behind the rocks. "Can't be certain," he replied, his expression grim, "but best we assume so. They're heading west, might be circling back towards Silver Creek after searching eastward." He glanced at the sky, where the sun had passed its zenith. "We should move. Stay in the tree line as much as possible." They mounted up again, this time with Nate in the saddle and Pearl seated behind him, her arms around his waist for balance. They moved at a steady pace, Nate constantly vigilant, choosing their path with care to minimize their visibility while making good time. As the afternoon wore on, Pearl found herself studying the set of Nate's shoulders, the way he held himself alert yet relaxed in the saddle, the gentle but firm manner in which he handled his horse. There was an integrity to him that she found deeply appealing, a straightforwardness that was refreshing after the calculated social maneuvers of Silver Creek society. "Tell me about your mother," Nate said suddenly, breaking the silence. "She sounds like she was quite a woman." Pearl smiled at the memory. "She was. My father married her in Philadelphia and brought her west when he decided to set up practice in Silver Creek. Everyone expected her to wilt like a hothouse flower, but she thrived. Learned to ride, to shoot, to manage a household in territory that was still wild in those days." Pride swelled in Pearl's voice. "And she insisted I learn too, said a woman needed to be capable, especially out here." "Wise woman," Nate commented. "What happened to her?" "Influenza," Pearl said quietly. "2 winters ago. It swept through town. My father and I worked day and night trying to save as many as we could, but we couldn't save her." She took a deep breath, the pain still fresh. "After she was gone, my father changed. Became harder, more concerned with appearances and position. The debts started piling up, investments gone wrong," he said, though I later learned he'd taken to gambling to numb his grief. Nate was silent for a moment, absorbing her story. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "Losing someone you love changes a person. Some find strength in it, others lose their way," Pearl finished for him. "I think that's what happened to my father, and when Blackwell offered to clear his debts in exchange for my hand, it seemed like the perfect solution to him. He couldn't understand why I objected." "And Blackwell?" Nate asked. "What kind of man is he beyond his wealth?" Pearl shuddered involuntarily. "The kind who collects beautiful things to display his success. His first wife died under uncertain circumstances." There were whispers, but his money ensured they remained just whispers. She hesitated, then added, "He has a temper. I've seen it slip through the charming facade he presents to society. The way he speaks to his servants, the cold calculation in his eyes when he looks at me like I'm a prize animal at auction." She tightened her grip around Nate's waist unconsciously. "I couldn't bear the thought of being at his mercy for the rest of my life." Nate reached down to give her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You won't be," he said firmly. "I promise you that." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the terrain gradually changed. The rugged hills gave way to more gentle slopes, dotted with stands of aspen and pine. In the distance, Pearl could make out what appeared to be fenced pasture-land. "Almost there," Nate confirmed, following her gaze. "That's the eastern edge of my property. The cabin's another 2 miles on, and Wildwood Station is about 3 miles beyond that." Relief washed over Pearl. They'd made it, or almost had. The fear of pursuit had been a constant companion throughout their journey, but now, with Nate's ranch in sight, she dared to hope that she might truly have escaped. As they crested a gentle rise, a small valley opened up before them. A creek meandered through its center, its banks lined with cottonwoods. Near where the creek bent around a natural rock formation stood a cabin modest but well-built, with a small barn and corral beside it. Smoke rose from the chimney, curling lazily into the evening sky. "Someone's there," Pearl said, tensing. "My neighbor, probably," Nate replied, though his posture had also stiffened slightly. "Patrick Sullivan. I asked him to check on things while I was gone, feed the chickens and such." Despite his casual words, Nate's right hand moved closer to his revolver as they approached. As they rode into the yard, the cabin door opened, and a burly man with a salt and pepper beard stepped out, rifle in hand. When he recognized Nate, he lowered the weapon, his weathered face breaking into a grin. "About time you showed up, Everett," he called. "Was starting to think you'd decided to stay in Denver after all." "Change of plans, Pat," Nate replied, dismounting and helping Pearl down. "This is Miss Pearl. She'll be staying in Wildwood for a while." The simplicity of his introduction contained no hint of explanation, and Pearl was grateful for his discretion. Patrick Sullivan's curious gaze took in Pearl's borrowed clothes and the bundle that contained her wedding dress, but he asked no questions. "Mrs. Sullivan will be pleased to have another woman around," he said instead, extending a calloused hand to Pearl. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Pearl." "Likewise, Mr. Sullivan," Pearl replied, finding herself warming to the man's straightforward manner. "Everything all right here?" Nate asked, glancing toward the cabin. "Right as rain," Sullivan confirmed. "Fixed that leak in your roof while I was at it. Clara sent over some stew it's keeping warm on the stove." He handed Nate a folded piece of paper. "And this came for you yesterday. Ryder from Denver delivered it." Nate took the paper with a nod of thanks, tucking it into his pocket without opening it. "Appreciate you looking after things, Pat." "Anytime," Sullivan replied. "Clara expects you both for Sunday dinner." With a tip of his hat to Pearl, he untied his horse from the hitching post and mounted up. "I'll let her know we've got a visitor." As Sullivan rode away, Pearl turned to Nate. "He didn't seem surprised to see you with a woman in men's clothing." A smile tugged at Nate's lips. "Pat Sullivan's not the type to pry. Besides, folks out here learn to mind their own business." He gestured toward the cabin. "Come on in. You must be exhausted." The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable. A main room served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace along one wall and a solid wooden table with 4 chairs in the center. A curtained doorway presumably led to a bedroom, and a ladder indicated a loft space above. Everything was neat and well-maintained, if modest. "It's lovely," Pearl said sincerely, taking in the homely touches: a patchwork quilt draped over a rocking chair, a shelf of well-worn books, curtains at the windows that softened the rustic environment. "It's not much," Nate said, looking around as if seeing it through her eyes, "but it suits me." "It feels like a home," Pearl assured him, sinking gratefully into a chair as Nate busied himself with stoking the fire and checking the pot of stew Sullivan had mentioned. As the warmth of the cabin enveloped her, the full weight of the past 2 days crashed down on Pearl. The escape from Silver Creek, the night in the wilderness, the long ride to Wildwood, it all seemed like a dream now as she sat in this peaceful cabin. Tears welled unexpectedly in her eyes, a mix of exhaustion, relief, and the delayed reaction to everything she'd left behind. Nate noticed immediately. Without a word, he poured water from a pitcher into a basin and brought it to her along with a clean cloth. "For your face," he said gently. "You've had a hard journey." The simple kindness broke something inside her. Pearl covered her face with her hands as the tears came in earnest, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She felt Nate's hesitant hand on her shoulder, a light touch meant to comfort without intrusion. "It's all right," he said quietly. "You're safe now. You can rest." When Pearl finally composed herself, she found Nate had given her privacy by turning his attention to preparing their supper. 2 bowls of steaming stew sat on the table, alongside slices of bread and a pot of tea. "I'm sorry," she said, embarrassed by her emotional display. Nate shook his head. "Don't apologize for feeling, Miss Pearl. You've been through more in 2 days than most folks face in a year." As they ate the hearty stew, a rich mixture of venison, potatoes, and carrots that Mrs. Sullivan had indeed prepared well, Nate outlined what would happen next. "You can take the bedroom," he said. "I'll sleep in the loft. Tomorrow we'll ride into Wildwood, see about getting you some proper clothes." He hesitated, then added, "I don't want to presume what your plans might be, but you're welcome to stay here until you get your bearings. The Sullivans have a small cabin on their property that sometimes goes empty, might be available if you'd prefer your own space." "You've already done so much," Pearl protested. "I can't impose further." "It's no imposition," Nate assured her. "Besides, until we know Blackwell's given up the search, it's safer if you're not alone." The reminder of the danger she still faced sobered Pearl. "Do you think he'll look for me this far?" "Hard to say," Nate admitted. "A man like that doesn't like to lose, and from what you've said, he sees you as something that belongs to him. But Wildwood's small enough that strangers stand out. Word would reach us if anyone came asking questions." The "us" didn't escape Pearl's notice. In just 2 days, this quiet cowboy had aligned himself with her cause, making her safety his concern. It was a gesture of protection that touched her deeply. After supper, Nate showed Pearl to the bedroom, a simple space with a sturdy bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window overlooking the creek. "It's not fancy," he apologized, "but the mattress is comfortable enough." "It's perfect," Pearl assured him, overwhelmed by his generosity. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." Nate looked almost shy for a moment. "No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Pearl said firmly, "not anyone. Most would have turned me over to Blackwell's men for the reward or worse." She met his gaze directly. "You're a good man, Nathaniel Everett." A flush crept up his neck, visible even in the dim lamplight. "Get some rest, Miss Pearl," he said softly. "Tomorrow's a new beginning for you." As Pearl settled into the surprisingly comfortable bed that night, wrapped in clean linens that smelled of sunshine and sage, she found herself thinking about new beginnings. She'd fled Silver Creek with no plan beyond escape, yet somehow she'd found her way to this peaceful cabin, under the protection of a man whose quiet strength and innate kindness stirred feelings in her that she'd never experienced before. Perhaps, she thought as sleep claimed her, her impulsive flight had led her not just away from a future she dreaded, but toward one she'd never dared to imagine. The next morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the small window of Nate's bedroom. Pearl woke feeling refreshed despite the aches that lingered from her flight and long ride. She found a basin of fresh water waiting, along with a clean towel and, to her surprise, a simple dress laid across the foot of the bed. When she emerged from the bedroom, dressed in the borrowed garment that was slightly too large but infinitely more practical than her wedding gown, she found Nate at the stove, preparing breakfast. "Morning," he greeted her, looking up from the skillet where eggs sizzled alongside thick slices of bacon. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Pearl admitted. She gestured to the dress. "Thank you for this. Where did it come from, Mrs.?" "Sullivan sent it over with the stew," Nate explained, serving up the eggs and bacon onto 2 plates. "Pat must have mentioned we had a lady visitor who might need some things." The dress was simple, a faded blue calico with no adornments, but it was clean and well made. "I'll have to thank her properly when we meet," Pearl said, smoothing the fabric. Over breakfast, Nate outlined their day. They would ride into Wildwood after the meal, where Pearl could purchase some necessities at the general store. "The owner's wife, Mrs. Hathaway, can help you with anything you might need," he explained. "She's discreet, won't ask too many questions." "I have no money," Pearl reminded him, the reality of her situation hitting her anew. Nate waved away her concern. "Consider it a loan. You can repay me when you're settled." His matter-of-fact generosity touched Pearl deeply. In Silver Creek, such arrangements would come with strings attached, expectations of repayment that went beyond the financial. But Nate offered his help simply because it was needed, with no apparent thought of what he might gain in return. Wildwood Station proved to be exactly as Nate had described, a small settlement clustered around a crossroads, with a general store, a blacksmith shop, a small church, and a handful of houses. Unlike the more established Silver Creek, with its pretensions to Eastern refinement, Wildwood was unapologetically frontier, its buildings practical rather than ornate, its residents clearly more concerned with function than fashion. As they rode down the main street, Nate on Chance and Pearl on a gentle mare borrowed from the Sullivans, several people called out greetings. Nate responded with easy familiarity, introducing Pearl simply as Miss Gibson, new to our community. If anyone wondered about her sudden appearance, they kept their curiosity to themselves. The general store was run by a jovial man named Harold Hathaway, whose wife Martha proved to be a plump, friendly woman with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at Pearl in the borrowed dress and immediately ushered her to the back of the store where women's goods were displayed. "Mr. Everett says you're in need of a complete outfit," she said without preamble. "Lost your luggage in the journey, did you?" "Something like that," Pearl replied cautiously. Mrs. Hathaway nodded, accepting the vague answer without comment. "Well, we'll get you fixed up proper. Won't have much selection compared to what you might be used to in the city, but everything's well made and practical." For the next hour, Pearl selected the essentials: 2 work dresses, a slightly nicer one for Sundays, undergarments, stockings, a warm shawl, sturdy boots, and various toiletries. Mrs. Hathaway added a few items she deemed necessary: a bonnet, gloves, hairpins, and a small bottle of rose water, because every woman deserves a little luxury, even on the frontier. Nate settled the bill without hesitation, brushing aside Pearl's renewed promises to repay him. "You can wear one of the new dresses out," Mrs. Hathaway suggested, showing Pearl to a small room behind the store where she could change. "I'll have the rest wrapped up for you to take." The new dress, a practical brown calico with tiny white flowers, fit well enough, though Mrs. Hathaway promised to make some alterations if needed. "Just bring it by when you're settled," she said, helping Pearl with the buttons at the back. "We women have to look out for each other out here." There was a warmth to her words that made Pearl think Mrs. Hathaway might understand more about her situation than she let on. Perhaps she recognized in Pearl the same determination that had brought many women west, the willingness to leave behind the familiar in search of something better, even if that something was not yet clearly defined. When Pearl emerged from the back room in her new attire, She found Nate deep in conversation with a tall, distinguished man whom he introduced as Reverend Thomas Walker, Wildwood's minister. The clergyman greeted Pearl with genuine warmth, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Mr. Everett tells me you might be interested in lending your medical knowledge to our community," he said. "We've been praying for someone with healing skills. Mrs. Sullivan does what she can, but she'd be the first to admit her knowledge has limits." Pearl glanced at Nate, surprised that he'd spoken of her abilities. He gave a small, encouraging nod. "I assisted my father, who was a doctor," Pearl explained to the minister. "I'm not formally trained, but I have experience with common ailments, childbirth, setting bones, and such." "That's more than we have now," Reverend Walker said earnestly. "Would you consider establishing a small practice here? The church has a room that could serve as a clinic, and I'm certain the community would contribute to your support." The offer was unexpected but thrilling. To practice medicine openly, to use the skills her father had taught her, but never fully acknowledged, it was more than Pearl had dared to hope for. "I would be honored," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion swelling in her chest. "Though I should be clear, I'm not a qualified doctor. Out here, we're less concerned with certificates than capability," the minister assured her. "If Mr. Everett vouches for you, that's recommendation enough for me." As they left the general store, packages in hand, Pearl turned to Nate. "You didn't tell me you'd spoken to the minister about me." Nate looked slightly embarrassed. "Ran into him while you were with Mrs. Hathaway. When he mentioned their need for medical help, it seemed like providence." He studied her face carefully. "I hope I didn't overstep." "No," Pearl assured him, touched by his thoughtfulness. "It's perfect, actually. I just didn't expect to find a place for myself so quickly. Wildwood may be small, but it's a community that values useful folk," Nate said as they secured their packages to the horses. "And from what I've seen, you're mighty useful, Miss Pearl." The rest of the day was spent meeting various residents of Wildwood, all of whom welcomed Pearl with the same practical acceptance. By the time they returned to Nate's ranch in the late afternoon, Pearl's head was spinning with new names and faces, but her heart was full of hope for the future that seemed to be taking shape before her. That evening, as they sat on Nate's porch watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson, Pearl found herself studying the profile of the man who had so dramatically changed the course of her life. In just 3 days, Nathaniel Everett had gone from stranger to protector to what? Friend, certainly, but there was something else growing between them, an awareness that made her pulse quicken when their eyes met, a comfort in his presence that felt both novel and somehow inevitable. "Penny for your thoughts," Nate said, echoing his words from the day before. Pearl smiled. "I was thinking how strange life is. 3 days ago I was about to become Mrs. Harold Blackwell, trapped in a life I dreaded. Now I'm here, with the possibility of becoming a healer for Wildwood, living freely for the first time in my life." She turned to face him directly. "And it's all because of you." "You give me too much credit," Nate demurred. "You're the one who had the courage to run. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." "Do you believe in fate, Mr. Everett?" Pearl asked impulsively. Nate considered the question seriously. "I believe that life presents us with moments of choice," he said finally, "and that those choices can lead us down paths we never imagined." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "Like when a woman in a torn wedding dress appears on a ridge above your campfire, and you have to decide whether to help her or send her on her way." "I'm glad you chose to help," Pearl said softly. "So am I," Nate replied, his voice equally gentle. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Nate cleared his throat and stood, breaking the spell. "Getting chilly," he said. "We should head inside." That night, lying in Nate's comfortable bed, Pearl found herself thinking about choices and consequences, about the paths that had led her to this peaceful cabin in this quiet valley. For the first time since her flight from Silver Creek, she allowed herself to think about her father, wondering if he regretted his part in pushing her toward Blackwell, if he worried about her safety, or if his pride had hardened his heart against her rebellion. She thought, too, about Harold Blackwell, about the humiliation he must have felt when she failed to appear at the altar, about the rage that would have followed. A man like Blackwell wouldn't easily forgive such an insult. Would he truly pursue her this far? Or would his pride eventually lead him to pretend she had never mattered, to seek another bride who might be more biddable? These thoughts should have troubled her sleep, but somehow, in the safety of Nate's home, with the sound of his quiet movements in the loft above, Pearl found herself unafraid. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her away from Silver Creek. And this time, she wouldn't be facing it alone. The week that followed established a rhythm to their days. Each morning, Pearl would rise early to help Nate with the ranch chores, feeding the chickens, tending the vegetable garden, and learning the basics of caring for the small herd of cattle that grazed in the valley. In the afternoons, they would often ride into Wildwood, where Reverend Walker was helping Pearl set up a small clinic in a room adjacent to the church. Word of Pearl's medical skills spread quickly through the community. Within days, she had treated a child's fever, stitched a gash on a ranch hand's arm, and advised an expectant mother on preparations for her coming child. Each successful treatment earned her more trust, and by the end of the week, Pearl found herself with a small but growing practice. She established a routine of visiting Wildwood 3 days a week, with emergency calls handled as needed. The community contributed what they could for her services, sometimes money, often goods or services in exchange. Mrs. Sullivan, whose herbal knowledge complemented Pearl's medical training, became a valued assistant and friend. Through it all, Nate was a constant, supportive presence. He never intruded on Pearl's growing independence, but was always ready with encouragement or practical assistance when needed. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch or by the fire, sharing the events of their day, reading from Nate's small library, or simply enjoying comfortable silence. It was during one such evening, as they sat before the hearth with mugs of coffee, that Nate finally shared more of his own story. "You mentioned once that you came west after the war," Pearl prompted gently. "Were you a soldier?" Nate's expression grew distant, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "Yes," he said after a long pause. "Fought for the Union. Enlisted when I was 18, served nearly 3 years." He took a sip of coffee, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Saw things no man should see. Did things I still have nightmares about." Pearl remained silent, sensing his need to continue at his own pace. "When it was over, I couldn't go back to Missouri. Too many ghosts there, too many reminders." Nate's voice was steady but tinged with old pain. "So I came west, like thousands of others. Worked cattle drives, ranch hands, anything that kept me moving, kept the memories at bay." "And then you found Wildwood," Pearl said softly. Nate nodded, a small smile replacing the haunted look. "Found this valley, more specifically. First piece of land that felt like it could be home again." He looked around the cabin, pride evident in his gaze. "Built this place log by log. Acquired my herd a few head at a time. It's not much compared to the big spreads, but it's mine. No one can take it from me." There was something in his tone, a fierce protectiveness, that made Pearl think there was more to the story. "Is that why you were so willing to help me?" she asked. "Because you understand what it means to claim your own life?" Nate looked at her directly then, his gaze intense. "Partly," he admitted, "but there's more to it." He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "The letter Pat Sullivan gave me when we arrived it was from a friend in Denver who works for the territorial marshal. I'd asked him to look into some rumors about Harold Blackwell." Pearl's heart quickened. "What kind of rumors?" "The kind that suggest his first wife's death wasn't as accidental as it appeared," Nate said grimly. "And that he's had business dealings that haven't always been on the right side of the law." "Why would you investigate Blackwell?" Pearl asked, confused. "You didn't know me then." Nate looked uncomfortable. "Because I knew of him," he admitted. 3 years ago, when I was buying this land, Blackwell tried to acquire it first, wanted to expand his holdings into this valley. When I outbid him just barely, he didn't take it well. Made threats, tried to scare me off." "What happened?" Pearl asked, riveted by this revelation. "Nothing came of it directly," Nate said. "But a month later my cabin was burned to the ground while I was in Wildwood. No proof it was Blackwell's doing, but—" He shrugged, leaving the implication clear. "So you rebuilt," Pearl said, understanding dawning. "And that's why you were in Silver Creek, recently keeping an eye on Blackwell." Nate nodded. "When I heard rumors he was to be married, I was curious about what kind of woman would willingly tie herself to such a man." A rueful smile crossed his face. "Then I saw you running across the prairie in your wedding dress, and I had my answer, the kind who wouldn't." The pieces fell into place for Pearl. Nate's immediate willingness to help her, his understanding of the threat Blackwell posed, his protectiveness, it all made sense now. "We have a common enemy," she said quietly. "We do," Nate agreed. "But that's not why I helped you, Pearl. Not entirely." His use of her name without the formal miss sent a small thrill through her. "I helped you because what I saw that day was a woman of extraordinary courage, willing to face the unknown rather than surrender her freedom. That kind of courage deserves to be honored." Their eyes met across the small space between their chairs, and Pearl felt something shift between them, a deepening of the connection that had been growing since that first night by the campfire. It wasn't just gratitude she felt for Nate anymore, nor was it simply admiration for his kindness and integrity. It was something more profound, something that made her breath catch and her heart race. Before either of them could acknowledge what hung in the air between them, a sharp knock at the door broke the moment. Nate was on his feet instantly, hand moving to the revolver he kept nearby. "Who's there?" he called, positioning himself between Pearl and the door. "Patrick Sullivan," came the response. "Got news you need to hear, Nate." Nate opened the door to admit his neighbor, whose expression was grave. "Evening, Pearl," Sullivan greeted her before turning to Nate. "Ryder came through Wildwood this afternoon, asking questions about a young woman matching Pearl's description. Said he represented a concerned father looking for his runaway daughter." Pearl's blood ran cold. "Blackwell's men," she whispered. Sullivan nodded. "That'd be my guess. No one in town gave you away. Folks here are loyal to their own, and you're one of us now. But thought you should know they're getting close." "Did he say if he was continuing on or heading back to report?" Nate asked, his expression hardening. "Said he had other settlements to check," Sullivan replied. "But I'd wager he or others will be back. Man like Blackwell doesn't give up easy from what I hear." After Sullivan left, promising to alert them if the stranger returned, Pearl paced the small cabin, her earlier contentment replaced by fear. "I should leave," she said finally. "Go further west, perhaps. I've put you and Wildwood at risk by staying." "No," Nate said firmly. "Running isn't the answer, not anymore. You've built something here, Pearl. A life, a purpose. We won't let Blackwell take that from you." "What choice do we have?" Pearl asked, frustration evident in her voice. "I have no legal recourse against him, no proof of his misdeeds. In the eyes of the law, I'm simply a woman who broke her promise to marry." Nate was quiet for a long moment, considering. "There might be another way," he said finally. "A way to ensure your safety permanently." "What do you mean?" Pearl asked. Nate seemed to struggle for words, unusual for a man typically so direct. "If you were married," he said at last, "Blackwell would have no claim on you. No father can force a married woman to return home or honor a previous engagement." Pearl stared at him, understanding slowly dawning. "Are you suggesting—" "A marriage of convenience," Nate said quickly, color rising in his cheeks. "On paper only, to protect you legally." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. "It's not ideal, I know, but it would solve the immediate problem." Pearl studied his face, noting the tension in his jaw, the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes. This proud, honorable man was offering her his name, his protection, with no expectation of anything in return. It was perhaps the most selfless gesture anyone had ever made for her. And yet, something about his proposal felt hollow. A marriage of convenience, on paper only. The words echoed in her mind, bringing with them an unexpected pang of disappointment. "I see," she said carefully, "and this would be a temporary arrangement. Until Blackwell loses interest or the threat passes." Nate looked up then, something flashing in his eyes that Pearl couldn't quite interpret. "If that's what you want," he said quietly, "I wouldn't hold you to anything more than you're willing to give, Pearl. I'm not Blackwell. I don't see you as property to be claimed." "I know that," Pearl said softly. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "But what if? What if I wanted more than a marriage of convenience? What if I wanted a real marriage?" The question hung between them, charged with all the unspoken feelings that had been building since their first meeting. Nate's expression changed from surprise to something warmer, more vulnerable. "Pearl," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been falling in love with you since the moment I saw you coming down that ridge in your torn wedding dress. But I didn't want you to feel obligated or rushed. You've had enough of men making decisions about your life." Pearl crossed the room to stand before him, her heart pounding. "I ran away from a marriage I dreaded," she said, looking up into his eyes. "I won't run away from one I desire." She placed a hand on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. "Ask me properly, Nathaniel Everett. Not for convenience or protection, but for love." Nate covered her hand with his own, his eyes never leaving hers. "Pearl Gibson," he said solemnly, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not just on paper but in truth, not just for protection but for love? For all the days we're granted on this earth." "Yes," Pearl whispered, tears of joy gathering in her eyes. "With all my heart, yes." Nate's arms encircled her then, drawing her close as his lips found hers in a kiss that was both gentle and fierce, tender and passionate, a promise of all that was to come. Pearl melted into his embrace, feeling as though she had finally, truly found her home. They were married 3 days later in Wildwood's small church, with Reverend Walker officiating and the entire community in attendance. Pearl wore the nicest of her new dresses, adorned with wildflowers Mrs. Sullivan had helped her gather that morning. Nate, in a clean shirt and his best trousers, looked at her as though she were the most precious sight he'd ever beheld. The ceremony was simple but profound. As they exchanged vows, Pearl thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from reluctant bride to runaway, from stranger to beloved. When Nate placed a simple gold band on her finger, purchased from Mr. Hathaway's general store with the proceeds from his latest cattle sale, she felt the weight of its promise. This was no arrangement of convenience, no matter how it had begun. This was a covenant of love freely given and joyfully received. The celebration that followed at the Sullivan Ranch was boisterous and heartfelt, with music and dancing and enough food to feed the territory. Pearl was welcomed into the community not as an outsider or a curiosity, but as one of their own, the healer who had chosen to make Wildwood her home, the woman brave enough to forge her own path. As evening fell, and the newlyweds prepared to depart, Mrs. Sullivan pulled Pearl aside. "I knew the moment I saw you two together that you were meant for each other," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Nate's been alone too long. He deserves someone who sees his worth." "I do," Pearl assured her, glancing across the room to where Nate was engaged in conversation with several of the ranchers. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his smile warming her from across the room. "More than I can say." They rode back to the ranch, their ranch now under a canopy of stars, so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch. The cabin welcomed them with the golden glow of lamplight, for Mrs. Sullivan had gone ahead to prepare it for their return, leaving flowers on the table and turning down the bed with fresh linens. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered each other anew. The tenderness in Nate's touch, the passion in his kiss, the reverence with which he whispered her name all spoke of a love that had grown quickly but rooted deeply. In his arms, Pearl found a freedom she had never known, a belonging that came not from duty or convention, but from the perfect meeting of two hearts that had somehow found each other against all odds. "I love you," Nate murmured against her hair as they lay entwined in the quiet darkness. "More than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," Pearl replied, her fingers tracing the contours of his face as if to memorize every line. "You called me brave once, but loving you is the easiest, most natural thing I've ever done." 3 days after their wedding, word reached Wildwood that Harold Blackwell himself had arrived in a neighboring settlement, accompanied by 2 hired guns. The news came via a ranch hand who had witnessed Blackwell questioning locals about a young woman matching Pearl's description. "He's not giving up," Nate said grimly as they discussed the situation with Patrick Sullivan and Reverend Walker. "And now he's close enough that someone might direct him here, even unintentionally." "We could leave," Pearl suggested, though the thought of abandoning the life they were building tore at her heart. "Go further west, start over." "No," Nate said firmly. "This is our home. We won't be driven from it by fear." He looked at Sullivan and Walker. "But we need to be prepared in case Blackwell comes to Wildwood." The men nodded, understanding the unspoken request for support. "The community stands with you," Reverend Walker assured them. "No one in Wildwood will betray Pearl's presence here." "It might not be enough," Sullivan said practically. "If Blackwell's as determined as you say, he'll check every settlement in the territory until he finds her." "Then perhaps," Pearl said slowly, an idea forming, "we should stop hiding and confront him directly." The 3 men looked at her in surprise. "That's too dangerous," Nate protested. "Blackwell's not a man to reason with, Pearl." "I'm not suggesting we reason with him," Pearl replied, her voice steady. "I'm suggesting we expose him. You said your friend in Denver found evidence that his first wife's death wasn't accidental. What if we brought that evidence to the territorial marshal?" Nate considered this. "The evidence is circumstantial at best, without witnesses willing to testify." He shook his head. "Blackwell's money buys a lot of silence." "But what about his illegal business dealings?" Pearl pressed. "Surely there's paper evidence of those." "Possibly," Nate admitted. "My friend mentioned land transactions that didn't quite add up, money changing hands for government contracts that were never fulfilled." He looked at Pearl with newfound respect. "You're suggesting we fight him not with guns, but with the law." "Exactly," Pearl said. "If we can damage his reputation, his standing in society, the very things he values most, he'll have more pressing concerns than pursuing a woman who rejected him." Reverend Walker nodded slowly. "It's a sound strategy. A man like Blackwell cares more for his public image than anything else. It would take time to gather enough evidence, Nate cautioned. And meanwhile, he's getting closer. Then we need to buy time, Sullivan suggested. Throw him off the trail somehow. The discussion continued late into the evening with various strategies proposed and rejected. In the end, they settled on a two-pronged approach. Sullivan would spread a false rumor that Pearl had been seen boarding a stage bound for California, while Nate would contact his friend in Denver to expedite the gathering of evidence against Blackwell. "And if he comes to Wildwood despite the rumor?" Pearl asked as she and Nate rode home that night. "Then we face him together," Nate said simply, reaching across to squeeze her hand. "You're not alone anymore, Pearl. Whatever comes, we face it as one." The next morning, Sullivan set out to plant the false trail, while Nate composed a detailed letter to his contact in Denver. Pearl, determined not to be idle while others worked to protect her, continued her duties at the clinic in Wildwood, though Nate insisted on accompanying her each day. A week passed without word of Blackwell, then another. The community remained vigilant, but as days turned to weeks with no sign of pursuit, Pearl began to hope that Sullivan's false trail had worked, that Blackwell had abandoned his search in favor of preserving his pride. It was a warm afternoon in early autumn when the illusion of safety shattered. Pearl was at the clinic, treating a young boy's broken arm when Mrs. Hathaway burst in, her normally composed face tight with alarm. "They're here," she said without preamble. "Blackwell and two men with him. They're at the general store now, asking Howard about new arrivals to Wildwood." Pearl's hand stilled on the boy's splint, fear clutching at her throat. "Where's Nate?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain calm for her patient's sake. "At the blacksmith's," Mrs. Hathaway replied. "Sullivan's gone to fetch him." She turned to the boy's anxious mother. "Sarah, take Billy home the back way. Quickly now." As mother and child hurried out, Mrs. Hathaway bolted the clinic door. "Howard will stall them as long as he can," she said, moving to the window to peer out cautiously. "Is there anything here you can use to defend yourself if needed?" Pearl looked around the small clinic, her mind racing. There was a scalpel in her medical bag, sharp enough to do damage at close range, but the thought of using it as a weapon made her stomach turn. She was a healer, not a fighter. "I won't need to defend myself," she said, straightening her spine as resolve replaced fear. "I'm done running from Harold Blackwell." Mrs. Hathaway looked at her with concern. "Pearl, the man is dangerous. You can't simply—" "I can and I will," Pearl interrupted, her voice steady. "I am a married woman now, lawfully wed to Nathaniel Everett. Blackwell has no claim on me, legal or otherwise." A commotion outside drew their attention to the window. Pearl watched as Harold Blackwell emerged from the general store, his expensive suit and polished boots incongruous in Wildwood's dusty Main Street. The two men flanking him were clearly hired guns, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, hands resting near their holstered weapons. And then Nate was there, striding purposefully toward the trio, Patrick Sullivan and several other Wildwood men close behind. From her vantage point, Pearl couldn't hear the exchange, but she could see the tension in Nate's shoulders, the cold fury in his stance as he confronted Blackwell. "I need to go to him," Pearl said, moving toward the door. Mrs. Hathaway caught her arm. "Wait," she urged. "Let the men handle this." But Pearl shook her head, gently but firmly removing the older woman's hand. "This is my fight too," she said, "and I won't hide while my husband faces it for me." Outside, the confrontation was escalating. Blackwell's voice carried clearly now, his cultured tones unable to disguise the anger beneath. "Harboring my fiancé, Everett. That makes you party to breach of contract, possibly kidnapping. Step aside and let me speak with Pearl." Mrs. Everett is my lawfully wedded wife, Nate replied, his voice steady but dangerous. She made her choice freely, and that choice wasn't you, Blackwell. I suggest you accept that and return to Silver Creek. Blackwell's laugh was sharp and humorless. A convenient story, but I know Pearl Gibson. She wouldn't marry a nobody rancher when she could have had all I offered her. That's where you're wrong. Pearl's voice cut through the tension as she stepped out of the clinic, head held high. Every eye turned to her as she walked to Nate's side, her hand finding his in a gesture both defiant and intimate. I chose Nathaniel Everett precisely because he offered me what you never could, Harold, she continued, meeting Blackwell's cold stare without flinching. Freedom, respect, love. Blackwell's face darkened with rage. You humiliated me, he snarled, taking a step toward her. Left me standing at the altar while the entire town watched. Did you think there would be no consequences for such an insult? Stay back, Nate warned, his free hand moving to his revolver. Behind him, Sullivan and the other men shifted, hands hovering near their weapons. Blackwell's hired guns tensed, creating a tableau of potential violence that held the entire street in its grip. For a long, breathless moment, it seemed that bloodshed was inevitable. Then Pearl spoke again, her voice clear and steady. What would those consequences be, Harold? Would you drag me back to Silver Creek by force? Lock me away until I agreed to marry you? Kill the man I love? She shook her head, something like pity crossing her face. You can't have me. Not by threat, not by force, not by any means at your disposal. I am not yours to claim. You ungrateful little, Blackwell began, but Pearl cut him off. I suggest you leave Wildwood now, she said, her voice taking on a steel that surprised even Nate. Before word reaches the territorial marshal about certain irregularities in your business dealings. Before questions about your first wife's unfortunate accident become too loud to ignore. The color drained from Blackwell's face. What are you talking about? He demanded, but the flicker of fear in his eyes told Pearl that her shot in the dark had found its mark. You're not the only one with resources, Harold, she said calmly. Information has a way of traveling, even to places as small as Wildwood. She gestured to the gathered townspeople, whose silent presence backed her words. You may have influence in Silver Creek, but out here, different rules apply. Blackwell's gaze shifted from Pearl to Nate, to the armed men of Wildwood standing ready to defend one of their own. The calculation was visible in his eyes, weighing the risk of violence against the threat to his reputation, his freedom, perhaps even his life if the hints about his wife's death proved true. This isn't over, he said finally, his voice cold with hatred. You've made a powerful enemy today, both of you. No, Harold, Pearl replied, squeezing Nate's hand. It is over, go home. Live your life and let us live ours. For a moment longer, Blackwell stood his ground, pride warring with prudence. Then, with a curt nod to his men, he turned and stalked back to where their horses were tethered. The hired guns followed, casting wary glances over their shoulders as they mounted up. The entire town seemed to hold its breath as Blackwell and his men rode out of Wildwood. Only when they had disappeared from sight did the tension break, with sighs of relief and murmurs of admiration for Pearl's courage. That was either the bravest or the most foolhardy thing I've ever seen, Nate said, pulling Pearl into his arms. You really have evidence against him. Pearl smiled up at her husband, relief and love mingling in her expression. Not yet, she admitted, but he doesn't know that, and it bought us the time we need to find it. Nate shook his head in wonder. You are the most remarkable woman I've ever known, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Do you know that? I believe you've mentioned it once or twice, Pearl teased, though her eyes shone with unshed tears. The confrontation had taken more out of her than she cared to admit. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Pearl finally allowed herself to process the day's events. "Do you think he's truly gone?" she asked quietly. "Or will he return when his anger cools?" Nate considered this carefully. "I think your bluff rattled him," he said finally. "Blackwell's the type who values his reputation above all. The mere suggestion that you have evidence against him will keep him cautious, at least for a while." "And in that while, we find the real evidence," Pearl finished. "Your friend in Denver, do you think he can help?" "I'm certain of it," Nate assured her. "The letter I sent was detailed. If there's dirt to be found on Blackwell, Marcus will find it." Pearl nodded, settling more comfortably against Nate's shoulder. "Then for now we wait, and live our life." "Our life," Nate repeated, the words a caress. "I like the sound of that." In the months that followed, life in Wildwood fell into a rhythm both peaceful and purposeful. Pearl's medical practice thrived, with patients coming from neighboring settlements as word of her skills spread. Nate's ranch prospered as well, his herd growing, his reputation as a fair businessman and skilled cattleman extending throughout the territory. Together, they built a life rich in meaning and connection. The cabin expanded to include a proper surgery for Pearl, attached to a new bedroom that would one day, they hoped, be filled with the laughter of children. The community embraced them as one of its foundational families, their story of courage and love becoming part of Wildwood's lore. And when, 6 months after Blackwell's confrontation, news reached them that he had been arrested for fraud and suspected murder, the chapter of fear in their lives closed for good. Marcus's diligent investigation had uncovered evidence not just of business improprieties, but of Blackwell's direct involvement in his first wife's death, evidence compelling enough for the territorial marshal to act. "It's over," Nate said as they read the newspaper account of Blackwell's arrest. "Truly over." Pearl set the paper aside, her hand moving to rest on her stomach where their first child was just beginning to make its presence known. "Not over," she corrected gently, guiding his hand to join hers. "Just beginning." Nate's eyes widened, joy blooming across his features. "Pearl, are you certain?" "As certain as a woman trained in medicine can be," she replied, laughing as he swept her into a careful embrace. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Pearl reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. From runaway bride to beloved wife and soon-to-be mother, her path had been neither straight nor easy. But each step, each choice, even the desperate flight from Silver Creek that had seemed so reckless at the time, had led her here, to this man, this home, this life. "What are you thinking about?" Nate murmured, his hand tracing gentle patterns on her back. "About courage," Pearl replied, "and how sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to leap into the unknown, trusting that something better awaits us there." "I'm glad your leap led you to my campfire," Nate said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "So am I," Pearl whispered, nestling closer to the man who had seen beyond the torn wedding dress to the woman, beneath the woman brave enough to forge her own path, and wise enough to recognize love when she found it. Outside their window, the vast Colorado sky glittered with stars, witnesses to a love story that had begun with a desperate flight and culminated in a homecoming neither could have imagined. They had both been searching, she for freedom, he for purpose, and in finding each other, had discovered something far greater than either had sought alone. In the years that followed, as Wildwood grew and their family expanded to include 3 children, 2 boys with their father's steady gaze, and a girl with her mother's spirit, Pearl Gibson, Everett never regretted her decision to run. For in fleeing what she feared, she had found what she loved. And in the eyes of the cowboy who had called her the bravest woman he'd ever seen, she had found not just a protector or a partner, but a home for her heart.